Everyone. So just a bit of housekeeping. So if you have any questions during anyone's talk, you just pop them in the chat, and then we've got our Q&A session at the end. So this is the session on canoe culture and heritage in Ghana, and we've got a few people lined up to speak about their research in this area. So I'll just ask them to introduce themselves one by one. So first up, we've got Professor Rose Boswell. Rose, would you like to switch on your camera and say hi and a little bit about yourself?
Hello, everyone. So my name is Prof. Rose Boswell. I'm an anthropologist and NRF research chair in ocean cultures and heritage based here in Nelson Mandela Bay in the Eastern Cape province of South Africa.
Thanks, Rose. And then we've got Dr. David Wilson up next. David?
Hi everyone, David Wilson. I'm an historian at the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow, Scotland, and researcher on One Ocean Hub. My work focuses on the history of colonialism and coastal communities, which we'll talk a little bit about today. Thanks.
Thanks, David. And we've got Dr. Gina Aduro.
Hello, good afternoon from Ghana. So I'm Georgina Yaudro, a sociologist with the Department of Sociology and Anthropology with the University of Cape Coast in Ghana. I'm also into gender studies. I love ocean heritage and culture. We are happy to have you this afternoon for our panel. Thank you.
Thanks, Gina. And last but not least, John, would you like to say hi?
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is John Windy Ansa. I am a sociologist and a political economist. I have been, working significantly on how to promote ocean culture and ocean fisheries related management through the use of politics and economic systems. So my presentation will try to bring out some of these things, particularly related to the relationship between economics and politics and how they promote fisheries management. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Okay, yeah, so just to remind you, if you have any questions, pop them in the chat and then we'll come to them at the end. And very welcome, as David says, to introduce yourselves and say where you're from and why you dialed into this. But yeah, very welcome. So yeah, Rose, if you're ready, would you like to kick off with your talk?
Thanks so much, colleagues. So I'm going to share my screen so that you can see my presentation. I might switch my camera off for a moment or two, depending on bandwidth, but we'll see how that goes. Let's begin from the very beginning. All right, so thank you everyone. So my presentation is entitled Locality, Identity and Conservation, how the concept of aquapelagos may shift concepts of terraqueous territory and intangible cultural heritage. So the presentation will be more theoretical and conceptual as opposed to being empirical or field-based. I'd like to thank the UKRI One Ocean Hub for the opportunity to present on this important occasion of the UN World Oceans Week. So just a quick 1 minute on the background of my work. I'm an anthropologist, as I indicated earlier on. I have field research experience in the Southwest Indian Ocean region, specifically in Mauritius, in Madagascar, in the Seychelles, Zanzibar, in South Africa. And I have been doing quite a lot of field research on the identification and management of intangible cultural heritage for the last 10 years. And prior to that, my work focused quite substantively on issues of identity formation in the diaspora, especially in the sort of post-colonial space. So I'm quite interested in the interplay of identity, of development, of livelihoods, and also the issue of intangible cultural heritage and its management, both locally and in the global space. The image that you're seeing is actually taken from my earlier field work in Zanzibar in a small village called Bumbwini village. And if we have time towards the end, I'll tell you a little bit about that. Just some publications, some of which may be of interest to participants and also co-panelists. I'm quite interested, of course, given the worldwide COVID pandemic. I'm interested in the impact of COVID on livelihoods and on the management of heritage in a radically changed context. And there are a few papers in press, some of which are co-authored. The first one being including the Khoisan, which is the first indigenous peoples of South Africa, for a more inclusive blue economy in South Africa. And then also forthcoming is a paper on art and the senses for ocean conservation, which is in the Journal of Island and Marine Cultures. There are a number of pieces there, and you'll see that quite a bit of my work is also focused on the role of the senses in shifting concepts of identity. So in a way, by turning to aquapelagos, I'm also looking at how other potential spaces or conceptualizations of spaces might actually shift the ways in which we treat and manage ocean conservation. So some preliminary thoughts. The oceanic turn in the humanities has had quite a large impact on social science thinking around the environment, around the place of human beings in the environment, about the impact of the Anthropocene or the great climatic changes that we're seeing now and the impacts of those on social communities. These scholars such as Isabel Hofmeyr and Pedro Pombo and others have explored or are exploring the work of the maritime in shaping coastal livelihoods, diasporic identities and histories. And out of this has emerged what we call wet ontologies, so quote unquote wet ontologies, how we can conceive of the natural environment, not from the territorial space or from territorialized spaces, nationalized spaces, but from the sea and from coastal areas and from estuaries and so on and so forth. And some of you, of course, will be familiar with the work of Delary and others on this, which emphasize the extent to which the marine actually has an important and strong influence on human society and states of being. Another concern which has emerged in recent times is that of the sort of post-humanist, what we call the post-humanist stance on environmental conservation. So for a long time, there was a more human-centric or more anthropocentric focus on the management of the environment. What is the role of humans in shaping ocean pollutions, the role of humans in promoting plastic pollution? But increasingly, and especially in the social sciences and in anthropology, we're seeing a shift to post-humanist stances on environmental management. So looking at the natural environment and looking at the particular place of humans within that environment as an equal species, or even as a lesser species within an environment that has an impact, on the existence, the survival of species globally. And I think this sort of post-humanist stance for those who are natural scientists here fits in quite well with the sort of ecosystem services approach, which identifies culture as an important variable in managing a balanced ecology. If we look at the sort of current discourses of borders, territories, and identities, we can see that these tend to emphasize the national, the territorialized, what we call land-based jurisdictions, especially for the lawyers who are here. Authority is also given to national government and international entities such as the ISA or the International Seabed Authority to objectively manage territory beyond national jurisdictions, or the BBNJ. And the institutions and associated processes, basically, I argue, they establish a hierarchy of relations and value that basically determines how and, who and how the oceans must be governed and managed. So this has a potentially negative effect on local communities, because they do not, in the same way as Marxists would say that one needs to lay hold of the means of production, they do not have the means of local communities do not have the means of conceptualization. So they're conceptualizing the oceans for themselves within their own communities, but they do not have the opportunity to share those conceptualizations beyond their own immediate communities, and to have those conceptualizations actually make an impact on national policy or even international frameworks for ocean governance. And I think that if we are, as the One Ocean Hub or any other environmental agency or a sort of collective of researchers basically seeking to change the status quo, it's important to give local communities the opportunity to not just to showcase their conceptualizations in a broader space, but to allow these communities and these conceptions to actually influence both policy and practice. What we also find is that the regulation of the borders that I've been talking about, the borders and territories, are also what I call textualized systems or relations. That is, basically communities are forced to articulate their relationships with the landscapes and seascapes in paper form. So it's always in the form of deeds, in the forms of documents, for example, that that have to be shared in order to demonstrate ownership or to demonstrate one's relationship with a particular environmental space. And anthropological research and sociological research basically shows that this is not the case at all, that if people wish to express their relationship or they might talk about, sitting by the sea to listen to the sound of the sea. So they have an oral account. Yes?
We lost you for about 10 seconds there. Could you just go back a paragraph?
Okay, I'll try because I'm verbalizing it. So I've been saying that relations and values that have been created under neoliberal systems also promote a sort of textualized approach to the conceptualization and management of the ocean, so that local communities who may not be using text or may not be using documents in order to articulate their relationships with the sea or with a terraqueous territory, they basically lose out because they do not have the authority, or they're not able to claim the authority to basically showcase their knowledge in a way that is powerful enough for them to be heard. And then, of course, there is resistance to radical alterity or radical difference. So, so for example, if ritual is an important way, or symbolic ideas or even belief are important ways in which communities express their relationship with with the sea or coast, that is perceived as so radically different. It's not within the usual frameworks for articulating knowledge and articulating livelihoods, that information then gets left behind. So what can the concept of the aquapelagos do for ocean governance? Well, basically, just to quickly clarify that the word aquapelagos is a combination, it's quite logical, it's a combination of aqua, water, and lagos, which means islands. It's inspired by the term archipelagos, which refers to a collection of islands that maybe share in a particular geographic space or a particular social space. The word has been used by the social scientist Philip Hayward in his initial study of the Haida peoples in British Columbia. And some of you will recall last year when we had the UN World Ocean Week, we had the artist Michael Yagulanas and also George Nuku, who were here with us on a similar platform, basically exploring their particular art forms. And I was then intrigued in particular by the work of Michael Yagulanas, especially his, what they call the Haida Manga, a cartoon, Japanese cartoon form, which he uses in order to articulate the particular nature of the terraqueous nature of the identity of the Haida Aguay peoples. And of course, what this basically shows, and I will show that in a few points now, is that it shows the indivisibility of human beings, that we're not, in fact, beings that are located in an environmental space, but that environmental space is a fundamental part of who we are, and it informs our identity, informs the way in which we engage with nature in the spaces which we inhabit. And a current paper that I'm working on is focused on marine influenced as opposed to historically or colonially influenced identities. And the attempt is to basically shift focus from political and textualized identities to forms of self and community that are forged in specialized environments. So what do the studies on aquapelagos, what do they do? Basically, they help to relocate indigenous knowledge, shifting economistic and juristic approaches to ocean governance. Indigenous forms, knowledge forms of the sea may be placed in the category of biocultural diversity, but as we are finding, it's so much more than this. It spans across many categories, including the spiritual. And in that way, they then shift attention from the economistic and juristic approaches to oceans governance. Secondly, cultural terraqueous territories and borders also shift attention from culture as a possession of a particular group that is circumscribed within the national space. So we tend to speak of nation states and ethnic groups and cultural groups within those spaces, almost as if they are impermeable collectives that are existing in a kind of mosaic of culture. But in fact, we find that these are groups that are shifting across different environmental spaces and that they have an intimate and profoundly relevant connection to particular environmental spaces. Another point that we need to make is that more focus on aquapelagos and such territories will shift attention to indigenous frames and perspectives of oceans and reveal the potentially negative effects of institutional practices in oceans governance that continue to marginalize local knowledge forms or local epistemologies and processes. Indigenous perspectives and frames have to this date, I think, still largely been ignored in global maritime histories. And this is exacerbating human rights violations because they're not even recognizing that people might have a different connection with the sea than what is actually promoted in the public space or in a public institutional environment. And we know, for example, that the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples emphasizes that, that nation states that are signatories to that particular declaration have an obligation to ensure that the human rights of the indigenous peoples are not violated. But if we're not even recognizing that people might have an alternative connection to the oceans, that their identities might be profoundly marine influenced as opposed to being territorially influenced, then we're not going to be able to recognize, to notice that these are human rights that are in fact being violated. A further point I think that needs to be made is that by focusing on aquapelagos and that intimate relationship that exists between maritime communities, their conceptions of the environment and the embedding in that social space, as what I saw amongst the Haida Gwaii, is that it also showcases the indivisibility of tangible heritage and intangible cultural heritage. At the moment, UNESCO is making this division between tangible and intangible cultural heritage, tangible being your sites, monuments, and archaeological artifacts, and intangible heritage being your rituals, your folklore, and other sort of, as the word indicates, your other untouchable heritage forms. And countless scholars have indicated the interweaving of both tangible and intangible, but perhaps only seeing this in the territorialized space. So there's now increasing interest on the interconnections between tangible heritage, intangible heritage in the maritime space and how that might influence local identities. A further point I think that needs to be made is that by looking at the situation in places, inhabited by the Haida Gwaii and other peoples, we also show that disruptions to locality can have far-reaching consequences. It not only diminishes livelihood, which is an important idea, or sorry, important concept for the UN World Oceans Week. It risks disruption of human rights and people's sense of being, which is intimately connected to and informed by the locality in which they have matured. So people are not just dislocated from territories, and often they express a fundamental, almost biological connection to such spaces. And I think this also challenges juristic concepts of personhood. The idea that you can have a passport and an identity document and that basically defines who you are. Whereas in fact, what we're seeing in the research is that people are really embedded in their natural environment, and that to disrupt that locality, either through commercial fishing and so on, that can have an impact, a traumatic effect on the peoples that are living in such spaces. Furthermore, from the anthropological point of view, we know that aquapelagos, or these watery territories, are also ritually inscribed places. In other words, they are ritually meaningful places. So it's not just part of an intangible cultural heritage, which they can share with a broader public in order to celebrate their cultural diversity, but they may have sacred practices that are ritually meaningful to them, which can only be expressed to members of their select community or cultural group. And because of this, we find that any disturbance to such aquapelagos, whether it's in the form of port development and so on, can affect ritual or ancestral ancestral well-being. So again, another realm of existence which our current ocean governance systems maybe does not recognize, because we only seem to recognize that which exists in the tangible, perceivable world. But for many people in Africa, there is the ritual ancestral world, which is as important, and also in the Southwest Indian Ocean diaspora, is as important to life and living and to livelihoods as is that which is perceivable, that which can be seen. So one would observe in the Ghana case, which colleagues are going to be talking about in a few moments, one can observe ritual activities that are taking place in such locales in order to emphasize ritual connections to such places, spiritual connections, which are equally valuable to local people. Of course, the expression of indigenous human rights are not homogeneous and may help, and it's important to publicly distinguish between these, because while we have, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and we have countries such as South Africa and Ghana recognizing their indigenous peoples, we need to also be aware of the fact that these human rights are not expressed or understood in the same way. And so not everyone, so it's very important. I mean, first of all, it is important to recognize the existence potentially of an indigenous human rights, because that also adds a new metric for transformative ocean governance. And then secondly, to recognize that not everyone will have a visceral or embodied connection to landscape and practices. But for those that do, those rights should potentially be recognized as part of the effort to realize a global biocultural diversity, which is becoming more important. I'm going to end very soon. So as I have already indicated, the work that is being done by the Ghanaian colleagues and others, it showcases the effects of disruption on localities. It emphasizes other values in those locales, the issue of ritual specificity, which I've already highlighted. It allows us to permit expression and recognition of indigenous human rights, and the fact that these rights, as they are expressed, are not always homogeneous or equally agreed upon and expressed. It can also provide a new metric for ocean governance. At the moment, we're focusing quite strongly, I think, on the economistic and the juristic, especially if we look at the BBNJ negotiations that are happening now. And also even from the South African context where I'm based, where the emphasis is very much on, we look at the economic and the natural values of the ocean. And it's only now that a concerted effort is being made to include culture and all of its specificities in considering metrics for ocean governance. And I think it's important to add that all of this basically advances a decolonized ocean governance. I mean, Africa is still very much in the process of decolonization. We talk about a post-colonial Africa, a post-colonial South Africa, but the form and the substance of that is incredibly varied. I mean, it is a linguistic process, it's a psychosocial process. And I think in this context of where I'm talking about aquapelagos, it is also very much a ritual kind of sort of an epistemological decolonization, decolonizing our knowledge frames and the way in which we perceive the natural environment and engage with it. So to conclude, the discussion on aquapelagos and these terraqueous or watery territories raises interesting issues about the extension of human rights to a broader segment of the global population. It also raises questions about human attachment to and embedding in particular territories and what that might mean for livelihoods. It tells us about the hierarchy of values, about dominant or hegemonic protocols for ocean governance and management. It tells us about the institutional control of oceans and the nature of inclusion in an inclusive oceans governance. For Africa, as I've indicated, it raises the issue of a decolonized ocean governance as it helps us to shift attention to local practices, local values and beliefs which are prevalent in our African context. Giving it the recognition that it deserves and allowing such conceptualizations to actually reach institutional spaces legitimizes or gives value back to African concepts and ways of being in the world, which at the moment is not really happening. It also may help us, as our colleagues from Ghana will show, it will help us to recenter local technologies, the canoe or canoe building, and the skills that have come with that through the generations as an important way, not only of restoring Africa's oceans and of restoring marine biodiversity through more efficacious means of engaging with ocean resources, but it's also important to sharing that knowledge with a broader audience beyond the Ghanaian space. However, this can only happen if Africans are persistent enough to foreground this knowledge in the spaces that matter, and sharing their ways of seeing the world without being worried about how these conceptualizations and ways of being will be perceived by those who are beyond their social reality. Yeah, thank you. I'm done. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rose. Yes, as we were saying in the chat, so please use the Q&A box down at the menu at the bottom to post any questions that you have for any of the panelists, and we'll, in the interest of time, we'll move swiftly on to David.
Thank you, James. I'm just going to share my screen here. Let's see, and I'll make sure that. Excellent. So hopefully you can now see that. Okay, so in this short presentation, I want to stress the continuity and adaptation in canoe use and livelihoods across the long history of pre-colonial and colonial Ghana between the 15th and the 20th centuries. Today, canoes continue to be central to coastal livelihoods, particularly artisanal fisheries in Ghana, and are fundamental for the sustenance, commerce, and identities of coastal groups. This has been in spite of centuries of conflict over the littoral zone, in which canoe users and their communities have consistently, but not always successfully, resisted attempts to limit or challenge their authority over this space. Surviving accounts of coastal Ghana by Europeans from the 15th century onwards are littered with descriptions and illustrations of the canoes and fishing activities of coastal inhabitants, particularly Fante fishermen. In the early 16th century, for example, the Portuguese referred to the area east of Cape Coast as Cabo das Redes, meaning Cape of the Nets, due to, quote, the many nets that were found here when this land was discovered, end quote. In the 1660s, Wilhelm Johann Müller, a German chaplain based near Cape Coast, wrote, "Every day except Tuesday, when they celebrate in honour of their sea gods, they go in large numbers 2 or 3 miles out into the open sea to fish in canoe," and also described that their principal fishing tackle consists of a net, hooks and barbed spears for throwing or stabbing with. He described that nets were made out of a tree bark by beating long leaves with a club, plaiting twine from the veins of the leaves, winding it onto a spindle, and then preparing nets with large and small mesh. Willem Bosman, writing in the late 17th century, described, with the least sort of canoes, with 2 or 3 men in each, they generally go a-fishing, and their fishing tackle consisting of great and small hooks, also harping irons, which they use when they have hooked a great fish. They are besides furnished with casting as well as other large nets, which last they plant in the sea overnight and draw them in the morning, when they are frequently full of all sorts of fish. It was fishing settlements and fishing communities that Europeans first encountered and engaged with in Ghana, and it was here that Atlantic commercial activities came to be concentrated during the era of first the gold trade and later the transatlantic slave trade. These fishing communities, of course, long predated European arrival and were already well connected to complex trading infrastructures, linking surrounding villages and interior markets. With regards to fish, women predominantly controlled the processing and marketing of catch on land. This was commented on in the early 1600s by a Dutch trader who wrote that, quote, "These women and wives very often buy fish and carry it to towns in other countries in the interior in order to make profit. Thus the fish caught in the sea is carried well over 100 or 200 miles into the interior," end quote. The majority of these coastal towns did not have natural harbours, but were surf ports, where goods had to be landed through surf-battered beaches. As a result, European ocean-going vessels had no choice but to anchor far offshore, and the goods and peoples had to be transported between shore and ship on smaller vessels, which you can kind of see in the illustration on the left-hand side. This required substantial navigation skills and local knowledge, as the rough beating surf meant that this was a dangerous and difficult crossing. Regular accounts of canoes overturning and those on board drowning, reported in 19th century newspapers on the right-hand side of the screen, attest to the danger of this space. And the frequency with which this was reported as a result of the large number of canoes operating on the coast also alludes to the fact that canoes and canoemen of Ghana quickly became the essential link between shore and ship. Constructed from cottonwood and sometimes wawa trees, surf canoes were solid dugouts fashioned from a single piece of wood and streamlined purposefully for ocean-going activities. These were craft that were perfectly suited and honed for the conditions of the Ghanaian coast. As Gina will discuss, these were more than inanimate wooden vessels, but were imbued with spiritual meanings and adorned with various carvings and motifs that signified owner and group identities, affiliations and beliefs, including membership of Asafo companies, which John will discuss. While fishing canoes tended to be smaller with crews of around 3 people, the growth of Atlantic trade led to the increased construction of much larger surf canoes, capable of transporting heavy cargoes with crews of up to 21 rowers. And you can see a rough illustration of some of these different types of canoes on the screen on the right-hand side there. Adapting and employing these canoes for Atlantic-based trade, canoemen quickly monopolised coastal transport. Their employment included transporting goods and peoples, including free merchants, mariners, soldiers and officials, as well as enslaved persons, but also involved carrying letters between coastal towns, peddling provisions to vessels anchored offshore, and carrying on their own coasting trade throughout the coastline. The role of surf canoes in shore-to-ship transport continued into the colonial period and only declined in the 20th century following harbour improvements and particularly the development of artificial harbours at Takoradi in 1928 and Tima in 1962. You can see on screen the continuing use of surf ports for lighterage services in 1958 at Accra, for example. Utilising their expertise to carve out a profitable niche within Atlantic trade, free canoemen were able to set the terms of their employment and their wages. This did not mean, however, that they were treated well by Europeans, who often viewed canoemen with contempt due to their control over the littoral zone, describing them as thieves, withholding their wages, and also seizing canoemen and selling them into slavery. Canoemen in coastal communities were not passive when such contempt and violence occurred, however. Instead, canoemen regularly withdrew their labour, refused to service European traders, and seized European goods and peoples in attempts to recuperate unpaid wages and enslaved community members. In the colonial period, between 1874 and 1957, this resistance was most evident when British legislation and ordinances threatened to restrict the activities of canoe users and their communities. In 1896, for example, the British Commissioner at Cape Coast ordered that all canoes that were beached near to Cape Coast Castle, the former British slaving fortification and then the seat of regional colonial governance in Cape Coast, the Commissioner ordered that all canoes beached underneath the castle were to be seized if they were not moved to another beach. The government stated that this was, quote, to give better facilities to merchants and to improve the sanitation of the town, end quote. It was claimed that this portion of the beach was waste and uncultivated land, meaning that it was not owned or claimed by anyone, which the government argued permitted them to reserve the beach as a landing place for their own government canoes. The fishermen refused, averring that the beach underneath the castle had been used for beaching canoes since time immemorial, and that it was the safest site for landing, whereas the alternative site that was allocated was more dangerous to their lives and more dangerous to their canoes. This was not waste or uncultivated land, but was land already claimed by the fishing community, which was not just where dugouts were beached, but was also an area of a meeting place where goods were sold, fish taxes were paid, and market prices set. It was a social space as well. The canoe owners took the matter directly to the colonial court, contesting the legality of the government's action, and they won, the court finding against the government. The fishing canoes returned once again to the beach underneath the castle, which you can see represented in a modern day image on the left-hand side of the screen there too. This relates closely to another series of disputes that occurred between 1898 and 1923, following the introduction and spread of the alley and Juvidor fishing nets along the coast. The alley net, a large herring drift net, seems to have been first introduced by Fanti fishermen in the latter half of the 19th century, with conflicts arising in Teche in the 1890s when Ga fishermen banned its use, as its small mesh was seen to catch fish indiscriminately, and it was thought that by throwing the dead bycatch back into the sea, that would drive other fish away. The Juvidor, a beach seine net, was introduced in the mid-19th century by Afedima, a female entrepreneur from the Anlo town of Wo. These were large nets with small mesh that were deployed by a small crew in a canoe, while a larger group of fishermen dragged the huge net to the beach, capturing all fish in its path. Beach seine fishermen were accused of depleting the sea of fish at the expense of others, resulting in numerous disputes, particularly as Anlo fishing companies migrated along the coast. At the centre of these net disputes were concerns of the sheer size of the nets, the unprecedented volume of the catch that they enabled, and their impact on juvenile fish in particular. When community authorities attempted to ban these nets in proximate waters, contesting parties would appeal directly to colonial courts in attempts to have these bans overturned. The precedent for this occurred in 1898 when Ga fishermen banned the use of the alley net following its introduction at Teche. Believing that the concerns of fishing communities over fish stocks were misplaced, this was overruled by the colonial judge, who stated that the nets would not have a detrimental impact on the fishing industry. Over the next 25 years of conflict, colonial officials also at times recognised that chiefs in fact could determine what kinds of nets be used within their boundaries. To stop the use of beach seine nets, cement boundary pillars were erected to delineate boundaries whereby the beach seine was prohibited by chiefs. But an equivalent solution was not adopted to deal with disputes surrounding the alley net, which was operated at sea via canoes and not on the beach, as colonial law stated that the sea and the resources of the sea was common property, and therefore boundaries could not be fixed at sea like they could be fixed on the beach. Yet colonial officials also mediated agreements between communities, where agreements were made not to use the alley net in territorial waters where it was objected to. Such contradictory decisions and statements were made across and within different localities, according to the perceptions of different colonial district commissioners, while notions of territorial waters underneath customary control remained unfixed and uncertain. This was a fundamental clash between colonial laws and the customary laws of fishing communities, as colonial law proved unable and unwilling to account for tenure rights that extended from land to sea, while customary laws clearly recognised the rights of local authorities and communities over adjacent sea spaces, in which the canoe served as the link bridging land and marine tenure, bridging the beach and the sea. The result was that these more productive and destructive nets were ever more gradually adopted, adapted and employed throughout canoe-based fisheries. Despite these interventions, it was only in the late 1930s that the colonial government began to intervene more proactively in the fishing industry. The attempted introduction of European-designed vessels with inboard motors largely failed to take off, but the promotion of outboard motors on canoes proved much more successful. While government credit schemes existed, women fish traders played a crucial role investing in outboard motors and providing canoe owners with the necessary credit to purchase outboard motors in order to increase the fish supply that returned on shore. This motorisation continued following independence in 1957, so that as early as 1972, 80% of canoes had outboard motors. Again, canoes, still better suited to the surf conditions of the vast majority of the coast, were adapted as new technologies were introduced and attempts were made to, quote, modernise the industry, end quote. To conclude, the long history of canoes and canoe-related activities in Ghana is a story of continuity, innovation, resistance and adaptation. Canoes were more than just watercraft and more than just income generators. They were imbued with values, meanings and characters that reflected personal and collective identities and were linked to customary regimes that also extended across land and sea. Canoe users and their communities regularly moved to protect and advance their interests over that space and over those resources. European traders and later the British colonial government failed to restrict or control the practice of canoe users and their communities in Ghana, but colonial interventions in local disputes did work to undermine the customary authority that had been vital to conservation and ocean governance in practice. This imposed a system whereby tenure was recognised on land, but where communal authority over adjacent sea space and the activities occurring there was left ambiguous within colonial and later state law, meaning that law in the books did not reflect law on the ground. And the role of community authorities within ocean governance was left unclear, uncertain and unrecognised, at the same time that the artisanal fishing industry was rapidly expanding largely on its own terms, and also at the same time, crucially, that a substantial industrial fishing sector was also emerging in the latter half of the 20th century. Thank you, and there's some more further reading on the screen if you want to delve into this history a bit more. I highly recommend Kevin Dawson's Undercurrents of Power too. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks David, that was really interesting. Brilliant. So again, reminder, pop the questions in the Q&A box, and then let's hear from Gina next. Thank you.
Hello, at this point, I think that Senia will show a short documentary, then I'll pick it up from there.
Yes,
if Senia is on, she should please. Yes. There's something to the sound. Seems like the sound is having issues.
Documentary from the Ghana team on the topic Canoe culture and heritage in Ghana, and it forms part of this year's World Ocean Week celebration. That's World Ocean Week celebration 2021, where we consider the key role of canoes in our day-to-day affairs among coastal peoples in Ghana and in fisheries management. In this short documentary, we are going to look at symbolism of canoe in terms of canoe inscriptions. We're going to look at its relationship with festivals among coastal people, and then the role of Asafo group, who are warriors, and the key role they play in fisheries management. So in our presentation, you're going to have a panel of 4 members. Professor Rose Boswell from Nelson Mandela University, who will set the pace with her theoretical and conceptual framework, followed by Dr. David Wilson from the University of Strathclyde, who is a historian and who approaches the topic from a historical perspective. Then the case study from Ghana will continue, and here Gina Odro continues with canoe inscriptions and festivals, followed by Dr. John Ansah, who also looks at Asafo Company and fisheries management. Welcome, sit back and enjoy this short documentary. Thank you very much.
Hello, greetings from Ghana. Here am I standing on one of the beaches where the OH research is taking place in Ghana, that is APAM. Behind me are a number of canoes. And canoes are full of symbolism in Ghana, in that they occupy important place in Ghanaian sociocultural space among coastal peoples and then communities. Canoes are full of symbolism in that they provide livelihood, but they are also symbols of heritage. But then how are these canoes designed? What are some of the belief systems associated with it? What are some of the rituals that come in when canoes are being designed? And what is this relationship with Asafo companies, who are the warriors and political organization in fisheries management? What about festivals at all? These are some of the things we want to explore.
Well, this is John Windy Ansa, and I'm standing right at the Cape Coast beach, and surrounding me are canoes. These canoes are supposed to be used in a manner that would ensure that the fishermen who use it as part of their ocean tangibles would have their livelihood sustained. Now, there's a group that ensures that these canoes are used in the right manner to sustain the livelihoods of the fishermen. These are the Asafo companies. Over the years, how have they evolved? What specific roles do they really play to ensure that these canoes are used in a rightful manner? And then within the context of social change, how do they also reconfigure their roles to ensure that whatever the canoes are supposed to do for the fishermen, is actually done? And these are some of the things that we are going to be discussing as part of the World Oceans Conference. Well, so listeners and participants, our video has given us enough insight about how canoes can play an important role in our socio-cultural environment, in our economic environment, and how they improve the livelihoods of people. And we have seen that, yes, clearly they are very useful and they have cultural significance, they have economic significance. But above all, you can see that they are rooted within our beliefs, they are rooted within our social structure. But changes have happened. And these changes that have happened, of course, have influenced them positively and negatively. And the point is that they have still maintained, we've seen as of groups, and they have still maintained their importance. And we've seen these canoes, no matter how these changes have taken place, they are still sources of livelihoods as an ocean tangible. I'm sure that we will still see that canoes will forever be with us as far as fisheries are concerned. Thank you.
Hello, good afternoon from Ghana. So we just finished watching the short documentary, which helps situate some of the discussions we've had this morning from David and also from Rose. So we are coming in with contextual factors. But before then, we want to thank the One Ocean Hub Research Project, which is led by the University of Strathclyde, for creating this platform for us to be part of this year's World Ocean Week. This is the third in a series of webinars, and we encourage colleagues to join us. So I'm looking at the connection between intangible heritage and the intangible heritage, looking at heritage and livelihood in the case of inscriptions and festivals in coastal Ghana. And then in the course of the discussion, the basic introduction, canoe inscriptions and symbolism, canoes and festivals, and its implication for livelihoods, heritage, and then ocean governance. And as Rose said, canoes carry huge symbolism in Ghana. The fact is, Sanya, okay. So canoes are first tangible vessels in that we see them. And when we see them, it's very easy to associate canoes with fish and, for that matter, livelihood. That it provides food, but it also provides employment. But it goes beyond the physical or the visible. This is where I come in, looking at it with the symbols and meanings that are associated with it. And if you're talking about symbols and meanings from a sociological context, then it could be situated within the symbolic interactionist perspective, which has George Herbert Mead as the theories associated with it. In Ghana, canoes, just like other parts of the world, are everywhere, especially among the 4 coastal regions, which is the Central region, the Western region, the Greater Accra region, and then the Volta regions. These are 4 out of the 16 regions in Ghana. And here, as we saw in the short documentary, the canoes are adorned with numerous inscriptions, but also designs and colors. They are very, very colorful. And this reflects many ideas, but also Ghanaian philosophy. For example, outside canoes, it is common to come across vehicles, which are commonly known as trotros, which has such inscriptions on. We have the wooden vehicles known in Ghana as kuko. They also have inscriptions on taxis are not left out. And even in front of stores and shops, it's very common to see in God's time is the best, among others. And these inscriptions form huge aspects of Ghanaian sociocultural heritage. And they can be grounded in our Edinkra symbols, which has a huge history. Also, it's very common among clans and then groups to have traditional stools, which are also symbolic. Also, when chiefs and elders meet, we have linguists or staff, which has symbols on them. Our proverbs, our emblems, clans, symbols of clans, and then Asafu groups all carry different symbols with huge meaning. So here are examples of Edinkra symbols. For example, we have Sankofa, which means go back and take, which relate to our culture, that although we are encouraging social change and we are experiencing huge social change, there are some values in our Ghanaian culture that we still need to go back to. And this is not peculiar to Ghana, but also to Africa. We have in Stroma, we have Jinyame. Jinyame is the one below here. And Jinyame means that except God permits, nothing can happen. So there's this huge belief in the supernatural and the physical. And this has grounding in history. Senior, please, can we move on? So I'm picking, and these inscriptions come by themes. So for example, we have religious and biblical quotes. We have day-to-day philosophical sayings. We have gendered quotes and sayings. Some are also reflected in animate and inanimate objects like colors, flags, reptiles, totems, among others, and also songs. If we listen to the song we heard as part of the documentary, the huge connection there was superb. And then sometimes it even gives you goosebumps. So there's huge connection. That's the emotional connection reflected in songs as well. It's all part of this belief system. And then the meanings behind it. So when it comes to biblical quotes, for example, can we move on? It's common to come across, for example, these canoes had God is alive. You can't see it fully in this one. And then eradicasa, which means speak, God speaks. So here it's informed by someone's experience. And then finally God intervenes. So we have all these inscriptions on our canoes, and they are not limited to only canoes. Can we move, please? And these inscriptions are also in our multiple ethnic languages. Ghana is a multicultural society, so there are many ethnic groups. And in the 4 regions where we are doing our research, we have different cultural groups and then dialects in these regions. So with the religious quote and saying, for example, it's very common to come across a Canoe which has Psalm 23 on it, which is a very popular psalm, which looks at God as our shepherd. So God will shepherd us, will protect us in the midst of all challenges. We have John 3:16, we have John 11:35, and Jesus wept. And then we also have, it's not only the quotes, but in writing. But this doesn't mean that everything is biblical. We also have some in Islamic. It depends on the person's belief system and then which religious quotes one might want to choose. We have some such as God first, God is faithful, and then eradicasa, Yesu Omafa, meaning God is on my side. Mawu Yega, that is in the Ewe language among the people of the Volta region. We also have Dromoso, which is Adom or grace. And this reflects those from the Greater Accra region. And these are just examples. There are numerous of them, but time will not permit. But then what are these sayings connoting or portraying? They are interacting with us and they portray the religiosity of the Ghanaian or the African. As Mbiti long ago in 1969 argued, the African is notoriously religious. That doesn't presume that other parts of the world are not religious, but this is just emphasizing the religiosity and then how visible it is in our sociocultural space. It also connotes the stronghold of the physical and the spiritual or divine presence in everything that we do. As we saw in the documentary, where the traditional priestess went into the water with the herbs and all that, and we have all these connoting our religiosity, also the strong presence of the supernatural. Sanya, please, can we move on? We also have day-to-day philosophical sayings, things that are in our context. So on these canoes, the first one says, Obrasun into boase, which literally means that life is huge or life is big. So you need to approach it patiently. And then the second one in blue also says that Warabobo, so it's like it's up to you how you approach life. These are just, please can we move on? These are just examples. There are so many of them. And then talking to the few, this was an empirical study. We spoke with about 5 people. We interviewed carvers, we interviewed traditional priestess, heads of Asafo group, among others. And then talking to them, you realize that and then some few fishes, it's about their experiences in life, which is often reflected in some of these sayings. So with a philosophical saying, where such as Obrason in Titobobo, that is what I just, then there was another Obrasima in Kunyim, that if you are humble, you're going to be successful. There was another canoe which had one touch on it. And the explanation given by the owner says that his belief is that as soon as he go to sea, one touch, he's going to get enough harvest, bumper harvest to bring home. Then some also says sea never dries. So they have this huge belief among the coastal people that the sea is such a huge thing that it will never dry, meaning that food will always be available. There's always livelihood so far as the sea is concerned. And then Obatampa is the next word here. Obatampa, it reflects the matriarchal system or the matrilineal system in Ghana. We have a multiple heritage, but we also have the matrilineal accounts who dominate, who are the biggest group. And in Cape Coast and Elmina or in the central region, most of the groups are matrilineal. So Obatampa reflects the big heart of the mother figure and how she's always available to provide. So we also had that in there. Then there was another one which says, which also reflects that when your mom passes on, it also connects or reflects the matrilineal, that when your mom passes on, then your clan is born. So because we believe or we inherit from the mother's side. So when the absence of the mother means you're actually out there. Then there's another one which we picked from Apam, where I stood on the beach and then did the commentary. And it says, that when the fisher doesn't go fishing, he goes angry. I'm using more of he because it was such a gendered industry in terms of the fishes, but also the processes. We had huge women, many women in there. So you realize that in the day-to-day philosophical saying, which is very anthropological, but also sociological, it reflects our norms and value system. It conveys messages of wisdom. Someone said, when you go to the beach, you have free advice. And this advice is inscribed on most canoes. It's also about life experiences, but the perception of the sea, that if the sea never dries, then maybe I can do anything to the sea, having forgotten climatic change and all the practices that can affect the sea, because to the fish at the feet, the sea never dries. And the gender sayings in terms of the Obatampa, songs, and then proverbs. Excuse me, can we? Okay. Forward, please.
Gina, just in the interest of time, can you conclude your talk quite soon? So
we also had the flags and then the colors. And it's interesting, most of the canoes had flags on. These flags are reflective, not only from the Ghanaian context, but very global. Some we had British flags, some European flag, Chelsea, footballs, and a whole lot. And the canoes were also very colorful, which is connected with some of the practices of the Asafo group members. So they were all there. Can we move on, please? And the interesting thing is that these canoes are also connected to festivals that we celebrate, especially among the Elmina, the fishers in Elmina. And it's known as the Bakarchi Festival. Bakarchi meaning that the opening of the lagoon, for the lagoon to meet with the ocean. So that is another. And this festival is celebrated annually on the first Tuesday in July every year. And it's a big tourist attraction. So here we see livelihood at work because it's a tourist attraction. It's also providing jobs, but also providing food. So we see all this. And the festival, some of what we saw in the documentary reflect the festival, but there are also women in there as reflected in this picture over here. Can we move on? I'm almost at the end of my presentation. And then I've spoken a bit about the festival, so I'll leave that out. But then the question that comes up is, what is the implication of these inscriptions, and then its connection with festival for the One Ocean Hub research project, and also for fisheries governance and fisheries management. That is, Sanya, please move. That is a question that should be of interest to us as researchers, as practitioners, but also as people celebrating the World Ocean Week. This is a summary of everything. So we realize that the canoe is a visible vessel here. It's a tangible vessel over here, but then which provides livelihood in the form of food, employment, and all that. But it's also connected with intangibles, which is another in the blue arrow. So here, the huge symbolism is very, very important. So it means that in terms of maybe improving fisheries governance, we also need to understand the belief system that undermines or underpins people's action to improve or to bring in interventions. That is what it's saying. So it has huge implication for fisheries management, but also for ocean governance. So I will end here, and then when the opportunity comes for questions and answers, I will come in again. Thank you very much. I think Dr. Ansa will pick up and continue with what needs to be done. Thank you.
Thanks, Gina. Yes, John, please take the wheel when you're ready.
Well, thank you very much. I guess I may have to make my presentation very short, so that we can make much time for questions and answers. The good thing is that our video was able to give us a very good context within which, we would be able to explore our issues. So I wouldn't want to bore you so much, with all these contextual information. But then what I would want to make quite clear is that as far as my topic is concerned, which is about Asafo companies and how the roles they play, as far as canoe-related fisheries management is concerned, I've decided to conceptualize canoe-related fisheries management to mean those efforts, that are associated with sustainable use of canoes for the improvement of livelihoods of fishermen who use these canoes as an ocean tangible. I have two major questions I would want to answer in this short presentation. What's the first? But maybe the major question has to do with the nexus, between Asafo companies and fisheries management. The two major specific questions that I have. One, the traditional roles that Asafo companies play, and the fact that these roles have been sustained over time. What are these roles? And then over the years, with social change taking place, how have these roles been configured within the modern political and other institutional context? So a little bit of background information about the Asafo companies in Cape Coast. In Cape Coast, there are 7 Asafo companies. These Asafo companies have specific roles which they play. Unique as these groups may be, those specific roles can be identified, but the generic roles are what we're actually going to identify and discuss. It is important for us to note that these Asafo companies have certain connections with issues about migration. The point is that for every Asafo company that we see, each company is actually a migrant group. Cape Coast originally was not inhabited by any of these Asafo companies, but with time, these Asafo companies actually moved. And one of the things we need to appreciate is that, for each Asafo company, there is a particular geographical space along the Cape Coast township where they occupy. Some are very close to the shore itself, and some are actually in the inland. And any Asafo company is actually headed by a leader who doesn't come in by virtue of ascription, but by virtue of merit. The loyalty, the hard work, and the commitment that the person put in, serve as basis for which the person, is able to ascend to the throne. So if you look at the Asafo companies, even though they are 7, I think it is important for us to note that 2 of them actually happen to be the original migrant group. And these 2 happen to be the number 2 and then the number 4. And the number 1, which happens to be a breakout group from the number 2, also decided to struggle and fight for a particular space along the sea. And for that reason, even though we, as I said, we have 7, it is only 3 out of these 7 that are actually engaged in fishing activities. And these 3, because they are 3, and collectively a name has been developed for them, and they are known as kwasa. So whenever the name kwasa is mentioned, it implies a group of asafo companies, and for these groups there are 3. So this is what we mean by 3 asafo companies. So with 3 asafo companies, it means Ku, Assam, and the name is actually used to reflect their presence, at the seashore, and it's also used as a label to show that they are actually engaged in fishing. And for the remaining 4, they emerged out of these 3, some on geographical lines, some on racial lines, and some depending on their social uniqueness. For example, the number 6 company, came out of number 2, because for them it's assumed that some of their members had some amorous relationship with the white. They ended up giving birth to mulattoes or half caste, and for that reason, given their racial uniqueness, they decided to separate themselves from number 2. Then some also decided not to associate themselves with the original apparels, which asafo companies used to portray. So by virtue of their social uniqueness in terms of the apparel they wore, they decided to separate themselves. So over the years, these are some of the changes that have taken place with regard to the asafo groupings. But here, as we said, we are interested in the role that asafo companies play as far as fisheries management is concerned. And one of the facts that we need to establish as far as asafo companies are concerned is that the 3 that we mentioned, all the members of those asafo companies are actually fishermen. So one could see a very strong link between what the presence of asafo companies and then fishermen. In other words, the fishermen themselves are asafo companies, and therefore the roles that the asafo companies play are characteristically seen as the roles that the fishermen play. And for that reason, one can see that there is a strong link between the political activities that these coastal communities do and then their economic activities. That strong connection is there. Beyond this strong connection, as far as the political activities and then the economic activities that these which one can see among the asafo companies, is that the asafo companies themselves, by virtue of the fact that they are groupings, serve to provide some occupational identity to a fisherman. So when a fisherman is able to associate himself with an asafo company, and by virtue of his association with an asafo company, he is able to organize his activities within that group. And for that reason, anything that he wants to have, anything that he wants to gain, once he is associated, those things can be obtained. So that the identity goes beyond what one can say is, what one can say he is part of, but it also helps to provide that social support, and then it also provides a sense of solidarity for the members. Then we can also see that what the asafo companies do, by using the canoes as fishermen, there are certain spiritual functions and certain political-legal functions that are associated with them. And I would want us to look at these functions briefly. In the first place, given the myriad of information that we were able to obtain from the interviews and the FGDs that we had, we were able to identify that as far as the asafo companies are concerned and the roles they play to ensure that canoes are used very well to ensure sustained livelihoods, 3 of them can be identified. First, there is a supportive role. Second, there is a protective role. And then third, there is a regulatory role. Now, if you look at the supportive role, there are issues about reciprocal relationships that exist between an asafo leader, who, as I mentioned earlier, emerges out of loyalty and commitment, and then the fishermen themselves, who apparently happen to be the asafo company members. Now, when somebody has a problem with the usage of a canoe, for example, he needs capital to help him, procure a canoe. When the canoe goes bad and then he needs money to repair the canoe, most often he relies on the asafo, leader, who would provide him with such a support, because most often the asafo leader is somebody who is also supposed to have some wealthy background. That person that provides that support, but in return to whatever that company leader does, the fishermen, anytime they are able to go fishing and are able to bring very bumper harvest, they give a portion to whatever they have had to the Asafo leader. And for that reason, there is this reciprocal relationship, which actually supports those who actually use canoe as their livelihood. So you can imagine how canoes usage are sustained by virtue of this reciprocal relationship. Now, there is also a protective, role which Asafo companies play, and this particular role, as I said, I would try to connect that with some of the reconfigurations that we see within the context of social change. On the Cape Coast, stretch, there is an emerging, phenomenon, and that has to do with the establishment of recreational centers as part of tourism. Now, what these Asafo companies do is that by virtue of the fact that they were able, particularly the number 4 company, they were able to capture those lands along the coast. They actually offer those. They have actually decided to offer those lands to those people interested in establishing the recreational centers. Now, the good thing in it is that by virtue of the presence of these people, it has reduced sand winning. And one thing you need to appreciate about the role of sand winning is that about the role of sand being present is that when the sand is is actually present at the seashore, it helps to ensure that canoes, when they arrive, they are safe, because when the sea moves and then and it covers the space, and it doesn't move as a result of the sand being there, it affects the canoe. The speed with which they get sport is high. For that reason, if these individuals are there and they are preventing sand winning, their presence there prevents people from coming over to win sand. And for that reason, it sustains the sand, and the fishermen are able to ensure that their canoes are well kept by virtue of the presence of the sand. It tells you that whatever the decision that some companies have taken in giving part of their land to people for recreational activities becomes very, very protective to canoe usage. Now, the third one is the regulatory function, which we can all see is important in the sense that, and these Asafo companies, one of the things they do by way of regulation is that they also ensure that some of the laws that have been established by a modern political institution, for example, the Fisheries Commission and what have you, relative to one, the use of a suitable net size, and then the no Tuesday fishing customary law, which is traditional. The Asafo companies ensure that the fishermen adhere to that. So what they do is that they do some monitoring. Whenever somebody goes to fishing, they check the canoes that the person, they check the net that the person is using. And when the net is smaller, they report the person to the police for action to be taken. Beyond all this, it has to do with the fact that there are conflict resolution mechanisms which Asafo companies have also put in place. So that when there are conflicts, intra-group conflicts, inter-group conflicts among the Asafo companies, these resolutions will be held so that the fishermen can go out. Most of these conflicts are fishing-related conflicts, sometimes high-sea conflict and all those things. They are settled so that fishermen can use their canoes to sustain, to promote their livelihoods. Now, when it comes to the configuration, one of the things we are seeing is that Asafo companies have seen the need that within the context of social change, particularly with regard to the fact that modern political institutions have emerged, particularly we have police, we have the Department of Spatial Planning, and then we have the MMDAs. These Asafo companies have not, separated themselves, but what they have seen as wise and doing is that they have decided to intersperse some of their responsibilities within the roles that, for example, the police would play. So, for example, as part of their monitoring and law enforcement activities, which traditionally, or for many years ago, they were not involving the police, now they have decided to involve the police. So what they do is that if they make any arrest, what they bring in the police to, cause the arrest, apply the sanctions, so that at least it will serve as a deterrence. And then the other thing is, they appreciating the fact that there are, tourism opportunities. What they have decided to do is also to protect the coastal space by giving the place out for modern recreational activities. So these are some of the reconfigurations that are going on as far as the Asafo companies and their rules, which they perform to protect the canoes are concerned. But there are issues, and these issues critical for us to appreciate. And of course, if we address these issues, the argument is that it will make the for companies very useful. One of the issues has to do with the fact that their relationship with the police sometimes make their work difficult, in the sense that the police end up engaging in corrupt acts. When somebody does something wrong, the sun winner is there, somebody uses the small net, the person is reported, the police arrest the people, and then later on those people are actually released, and it becomes a problem. The other one has to do with the non-recognition of the Ghana Tourism Authority, who is supposed to, an institution which is supposed to collaborate with them to ensure that they do what can be done to protect the canoes. And then the other one has to do with the fact that Christianity emerging, some of them are pulling out. For that reason, their role, their traditional role, which has to do with the performance of rituals, are gradually getting eroded. So on this note, we can see clearly there are three issues that we can glean out of this short presentation. We can see that what the Asafo companies do actually reflects an interplay between the politics and the economics of every fishing community, and their role actually help in ensuring that livelihoods are sustained. And these roles can be seen as plural. In a plural pattern, we see these roles being exhibited. The supportive role, the protective role, and the regulatory role which they perform. But over the years, as we have seen, changes have happened, and these changes that have happened, they have been able to reconfigure their responsibilities. But the point is that these reconfigured responsibilities are coming with some challenges. And as far as these challenges are concerned, if they are kept, they are seen and well addressed, particularly when these modern state institutions become aware of them, and efforts are done to address these challenges. I think that for companies will become very, very useful in partnering the key state institutions to ensure that canoes, as they are used, would serve the interest of the fishermen for sustained livelihoods. Thank you very much.
Thanks, John, and thanks everyone for your talk. So really, really interesting. So we've got a few questions in the chat. First up's Albert, which Rose, you said you'd like to answer. So this is looking at the diversity of cultures in coastal communities in Africa. How can the shift of culture as a possession of specific groups be achieved for inclusive ocean governance? If I could just ask you to keep the answers fairly brief because we've gone over time a bit. Thanks. If you could unshare your screen as well. Thanks, John.
Right.
Okay, thanks so much, James. So very quickly, I think it will be achieved with great difficulty because there is already a very long history of culture being portrayed and being promoted as a possession of specific groups within the African context, and also the fact that cultural groups also have great pride, in their cultural practices and beliefs and symbolisms. I think Gina's presentation showed so eloquently, and it will be difficult to achieve this. But I also believe that it's important. It's an important process because we must consider that culture is not a homogeneous kind of entity that can be perceived as the property of any particular group, but that cultural practices exist across groups. Culture is a process and changes over time. So I think with education, with time, that process can be challenged. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Does anybody else want to kind of make a quick point about that one, or should we move on? Okay, let's move on. So, next one from Georgia Duro. Has the One Ocean Hub team explored the extent to which canoes affect children's education along the Ghanaian coast? That's open to anybody, I think.
John, would you want to take that? How?
Yeah. Let me see. I think it's in a question box, right?
Sorry, John.
Yeah. I think it's the second question. The second question has yes. Yes. The amazing thing, we have discovered is that children come around, And there are let me say, along the coastal communities or the coastal communities, we see three categories of children. One category is children who are actually engaged in fishing who do not go to school. We also have children who go to school, and when they close, when they come, they join their, either fathers, brothers, uncles, and then they go to sea. And then there are some who go to school and do not go to sea at all. Now, so we see these children, especially those who do not go to school, for many reasons, which we would be exploring later, because normally the argument has been that it is actually as a result of poverty, but then it goes beyond poverty. Sometimes it's also about the trust people have in the educational system, the social connections that have been established, for which children would always regard fishing as something which would serve their interest till they die. So these children sometimes are attracted, and when they go there, they engage in the canoe related fisheries activities, and most often, insofar as some of them do not end up going to school, affect their education. For those who attend school and come back, of course there are some dynamics to it. One of the dynamics has to do with the fact that if there are things they are supposed to do right after school they don't get to do, the number of hours they are supposed to spend to sleep, after which they would have to go to school, also becomes a problem, because sometimes they end up waking up at dawn to join either their fathers, uncles, or brothers to go to sea before at dawn. Later on in the morning they would come back, for the canoe to be dragged. That is when they end up going to school. So indeed, for some of these children, in fact, as far as canoe usage is concerned, it affects their education. But the idea that it also serves as means through which children are socialized, then we can say that yes, it may affect formal education, but informally, I mean, they are also picking up certain things that may be useful in the near future for them. So it comes with two sides, and it all has to do with the contexts that are created to help them to balance the equities between having their formal education, which will make them useful, and then having something they can do if they end up in fishing. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, John. Anyone else wants to mention about anything in response to that question? Okay, let's have the question from someone else now, from Kenneth. Could the gender composition of the three main SFO companies in the Cape Coast have implications for fisheries management, particularly how women's work in fisheries? Maybe John, you want to start with that one?
Yeah, the amazing thing is that in every SFO group, the composition, I mean, there are males and there are females. That is one thing I never even imagined I would ever find on the field, but that is what I discovered. And so it's an interesting, information to actually decipher, And the women play very, very amazing roles. One of the critical roles the women play, by virtue, they actually form part of the monitoring team. They go around, and whenever they see something which is a violation to the customary laws or to even the modern laws, which found in the Fisheries Act, they report these violations, and they respect the structure, they respect the hierarchy, and by what they do is that by the respect of the hierarchy, they report to the leader, and the leader also takes it up from there. That is where, as we said, by virtue of the reconfigurations, some of these modern law enforcement authorities come in, So there are women involved. The only thing is that they don't go for fishing. But when it comes to the monitoring processes, when it comes to the spiritual functions, going around, performing the rituals, they are part of these activities. So there are gender dynamics as far as these canoe-related fisheries management issues are concerned. Thank you.
Thanks, John. So we've got a question for
please, can I add on? And also during the festivals,
okay.
I didn't get to present much on the festival because of my time. But during the festivals, they have this boats racing parade, and it's also based on that of a company. So they do share them. We have men, but also women. So the men may be paddling, and then the women are clad in beautiful, colorful attire, and then with dancing and all that. And sometimes the grouping is also based on ASAFO grouping. So there is gender in there as well.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, Gina. So we've got a question from Wisdom for you, Gina. Did you explore the role of sign writers and canoe builders when you talked about your work around the livelihoods?
Yes, especially, we spoke with 2 canoe writers. They call themselves sign writers and carvers. So, and interestingly, even the wood that is used in carving the canoes, they said is gendered. That some of the wood is assigned feminine meaning to it, that this is Yabisia, and then this is a male wood, interestingly. And then in the carving, we talked to, but they were all men, 2 guys. One at Elmina was 28 years. And then he said he did visual arts at the secondary school. And then he was doing normal painting, but he realized that the carving had more. And even in a week, he's able to get 4 to 8 work, carving or sign writing. Yeah, so we did. And then sometimes there are some rituals involved accordingly based on the person's belief system in the carving, and then others, because as you could see, although we didn't really, because of time, we didn't get time to show you all the pictures. There are some carving with symbols like animals, like lizard, like scorpion and others, and these are believed to be totems and emblems of certain groups. So yes, it exists, and then they have a whole lot of rituals associated with this practice.
Great, thanks, Gina. We've got a couple of related questions from Mansa and Gretchen around plastic waste. So have the issues of waste and trash in coastal Ghanaian waters impacted fishers and their canoes, and what do the fishers themselves say about that? I know this is something we've talked about in the project before, so I think it's open to anybody.
Yeah, let me take this issue. Yeah, Prof. Mazapra, this is something I think for us, you know, as Ghanaians, we keep on observing along the coast. It's been a systemic problem, but then it keeps on worsening as a you know, and the context and the factors are many. Modernity plays a role, the lack of law enforcement, you know, and the fact that our orientations, you know, keep on changing. But then I have, going to the field, I discovered something. For me, it wasn't something I thought I would see, but then it also adds to an understanding of why it is like that. You know, the waste itself, it becomes more serious at a point when the people develop that belief that, hey, there are gods who are happy with the waste. You know, there are gods who are happy with the waste, and even when the gods gain their strength when the waste is that much filth, human excreta. That is the serious part of it, and for that reason, it tells you that yes, we can do all that we want to do. We may want to do, you know, we may want to enforce all the laws, but it also has to do with changing the beliefs. We have always lived with the thinking that yes, the beliefs are always good to preserve, but some of them are there, and the content are very, very questionable. You know, so it is true that these plastics are here with us. Issues about law enforcement are there. Issues about orientations are there, but it also has to do with going back to, you know, change some of the traditional, you know, orientations that people have, you know. Yeah. So, Prof, it's a good observation, but these are the contexts.
But then what I may want to add to that is that with social change, we have the plastics.
Yeah.
So they have this belief, traditionally or originally, or in the past, we had other forms of rubbish or refuse, but not plastics. But the challenge with plastic is that it doesn't, you know, decompose easily. Yeah. So it's so obvious, and it's creating huge problems. So they also do appreciate that the plastics are creating problems for them, because there are times they go for fishing and the catch is full of, they pull the net with all the energy and everything, and what comes out is all plastic. So in some of, because we've been at multiple sites, and in some of the places they have this issue, like the reference John was making was with one site, but it doesn't cut across the 4 sites that we've been to so far. So they have issues with plastics per se, but they also have beliefs also with other forms of refuse. Yeah.
Thank you. So a question for David, I think mostly. So in the past, locations of canoes in the coastal areas of Ghana were very neat, and now the situation is different. What do you think accounts for this trend? That's from George Aduro.
James, yeah, it's a difficult question just to work out what would account for that kind of trend. I mean, the expansion of the artisanal fisheries sector would be one kind of obvious answer to that question, but also population growth, the growth of the fisheries industries, and possibly also some of the undermining of customary authority on shore as well. It may account for that. It's not something I've looked into as of yet, but it's an important question just to think about what happens to beach access and beach restrictions when that does become undermined via colonial interventions and then kind of ambiguous state law following that. So a good question, one that I need to look into a bit further, I think, but yeah, likely the expansion of the fishing industry and growth of population, most of all.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be tempted to add in a sort of fish biology angle to that as well, in that the fewer fish you have, the further you need to range to start to kind of get enough catch to sustain yourselves or your business or your family. So I think, you know, there's the issue of declining fish stocks as well plays into that, I think.
That's a good point, yeah, just kind of more concentrated areas of productivity. Yeah.
Okay, so probably we're a bit over time, so we've got time for I think probably one or two more questions, and then we'll have to wrap it up. But so the next one from me is, so as part of the many activities that go on along the fishing coast, is there anything that can point to conservation of coasts for sustainability, especially from the ASAFO groups?
Yeah, let me take it up. I think, you know, in my presentation, I identified some, you know, critical activities that they do. The spiritual activities, you know, which, you know, naturally is getting eroded, but still being done, you know, has a way of preserving the sea, because they use Tuesdays, which is actually a non-fishing day, to do that. And they ensure that that Tuesday, which is a non-fishing day, is observed. And that has its own way of sustaining, you know, ecological balance in the sea. There are changes, but then of course, these changes were not found in my fishing, so that's what I didn't mention. But information that we are gathering, which we want to explore further, has to do with the fact that for some of the fishing sites, they have actually decided to go on fishing even on Tuesdays. And these are things that we would want to delve so much into. And then the other one, which has to do with the fact that they play a critical role in monitoring the use of the net size, and that also has its own way of sustaining the fish stock, because now, you know, juvenile fishes will gain some protection, and, you know, it will mean that the fish, you know, can actually grow for them to be harvested. Third, the role they play in ensuring that sun winning is prevented. And here we did sometimes I mean, those efforts do not even require strong enforcement of whichever customary laws or modern laws that exist, but it also has to do with using you know, persuasive and recreational methods to ensure that, you know, these people will, I mean, some of these efforts towards sustaining the coasts and the ocean, you know, will be done. So indeed, the several companies are doing, but as I mentioned, they are impediments. And then one of the things that I meant, I think, you know, in addition to what Gina said, you know, the issue of, you know, plastic, yes, it's a problem, but you see, this is the situation whereby all wastes are lumped together. And for that reason, it is difficult to say that, yes, plastic is a problem, therefore let us deal with it and leave the others. You know, so at a point when, you know, a particular, you know, waste is not dealt with just because of a belief system, any other waste that adds up is not equally dealt with just because it is also considered as a waste. So these are the dynamics. So it's sometimes very difficult for them to even separate the waste and say that this is a problem, that's not a problem. And for that reason, the beliefs that underpin them, you know, also makes it very, you know, make it very, very difficult for them to even address the bigger challenge as far as waste, you know, management is concerned.
Thanks, John. So James had to leave because we ran over a little bit. So I'll take over as chair for. I think we can get, I guess, 2 more questions in if that's all right. So for Dr. Gina, on the gendered nature of fishing in Ghana and other parts of Africa, please, did you ever come across women who were actually into fishing rather than processing, and men who are solely into fish processing? If so, how did the Ghanaian society perceive such people?
Okay, thanks, member chair or panel chair, is it? Because maybe you,
all roles, it's fine.
You are a panel and now you are a chair, so I'll address you as such. So in terms of the fishes, going to sea or being on the canoe per se, we've not come across women yet. We are still, this research is unfolding. So we are yet to see if we encounter, but going to sea itself, because there are even places where they have taboos that women can't even climb the canoe. So it's highly gendered. But when it comes to the processing, they are very much in there. And when the catch is brought to shore, there are also women who sort of receive, and then we have the queen. It's a structure, it's a governance structure. They receive, they share, they have the groupings who buy from this canoe and all that. With men involved in processing, yes, we came across some. And personally, I even have a male friend who is into processing, who brings me fish. We are on the coast in Cape Coast, who brings me. So we have a lot of males involved, some in salting, some in scaling, and then cutting and preparing them. Others smoking, not too many of them. We've not, but then with the processing and distribution, we have men in there. Yes.
Thanks, Gina. And even just to add from the kind of historical perspective as well, throughout the history of Ghana and fishing that I've looked at, women are key to investing in nets and owning canoes as well. So it's excellent. Yeah. Perfect. So I think we can take one more question if that's okay with everyone. I'll take one here from Harrison to John. Heritage is intertwined with identity and territory, where individuals or communities are often in competition or outright conflict. Have you heard any of such issue where various Asafo groups in Cape Coast disputing the right to define and manage this cultural heritage?
Yeah, indeed. Thank you very much. I think in my presentation, I mentioned that disputes do happen, and these disputes have been long-standing. And as I mentioned, the original occupants or the original migrants, as far as Asafo companies are concerned, even though they are 7, they were 2. Then Asafo number 2, the Asafo number 1 actually happens to be a breakout group from the Asafo number 2. And it was a dispute over land space, and for that reason, when the dispute was settled, the decision was that, yes, the breakaway group should also have a space which they can operate. And then the 2 also had a space. What happened was that the 2, realized that they had a smaller space. So for them, they had negotiations with the Asafo number 4, who have a very large, span of land. And the Asafo number 4 decided to give them a portion of their land. So disputes do happen. Now, the disputes go beyond even the territories. It also happens on the sea. When they are moving their boats, I think there is a question on colors, and I would want to answer that question and tie it with this submission. Yes, the Asafo companies have colors. Those who are along the sea, they have their colors, and they inscribe these colors on their canoes. The Asafo number 1 have red as their color, blue and white for Asafo number 2, and then yellow for Asafo number 4. And that is what also, this is something symbolic, as which also serves as a source of identity. So you can see it as a canoe, and you can associate yourself with it, given that's of a company in which you find yourself. Now, when they move to on the sea, they realize that, yes, sometimes given a location where they know all of them are aware that there could be large stock of fish, they all move towards that area. But when they get there, there are disputes. Who to throw the net first? The other group does not, would not allow, and it creates that confusion. But as part of that, they have their own internal mechanisms at resolving such disputes. And sometimes when they do it, it helps to maintain that cultural heritage. Yeah.
Thank you, John. Excellent. Okay, so I think I've just about managed to answer most questions in there. Sorry if your question didn't get answered, but we have went over time by a little bit as well. So thank you again to Rose, to Gina, to John for your papers.
And to Dave.
And thank you. And thank you everyone for joining us today as well. for an
And to
excellent discussion.
James, though he's not here, we need to carry his message to him, and to James, and to Senia, and to Laura, and to everyone, and to Eliza, and to all the team out there in Strike, and to our panelists, actually, our attendees. Without them, we didn't have had this engaging section, so we appreciate their presence as well, and their contributions and questions. Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very
Bye,
much.
everyone.
Bye-bye.
Okay, bye.